So now we're going to look at an article by Scott Wright and Ainslie Schultz called "The Rising Tide of Artificial Intelligence and Business Automation, Developing an Ethical Framework." And the idea will be to see to what extent businesses ought to do in relation to automation. With automation, do businesses have certain responsibilities to workers? What is the most ethical way in which they can approach automation? So, first, we're going to look at the evolution of labor markets and business automation. So, it's just a historical fact that machines have matched or outperformed humans in a range of activities, and they increasingly do so. So, whatever a human can do in a factory, a machine can do much more efficiently. Now, because of this, many predict that developments in automation will dramatically affect workers, businesses, nations, and so on, because this means, you could get rid of, potentially 25, 30% of a labor force, and that's going to have serious effects. And not only that, it's going to produce greater productivity and efficiency, right? So there are pros and cons to automation. Now, this means automation may, create an economic boon. Some people think where you have decreased costs and increased productivity. So for businesses, this can make a profit, because if you don't have to pay a worker and you have a machine that occupies that role instead, then of course you can save money. Now, this would also exacerbate social inequalities, because it means if people lose their jobs, then what do they do to, carve out a career for themselves and potentially, maybe a middle-class life? This means it would also spur labor disruptions. If you have mass amounts of workers being laid off because of the implementation of automation, this is going to cause a problem in the labor market. So we first want to look at this by approaching it through the lens of stakeholder theory. So to remain competitive globally, firms just will increasingly rely on automation to improve efficiency. That is just part of what's required to survive in capitalism. You have to always innovate, reducing your bottom line and thereby increasing your profits. Now, stakeholder theory asserts that companies that balance and attend to the needs of their stakeholders benefit because stakeholders recognize and reciprocate that goodwill, since they have moral obligation to their stakeholders. That, of course, stakeholder theory says a business has to take into account what is best for shareholders, for the workers, for the customers, and so on, right? Now, if we want to relate that to automation, here are some areas which stakeholder theory can help guide us as to what is the most ethical way to implement automation. First, we can take a look at labor, right, and the working aspect of the stakeholder of a business. So we can look at the extent to which a position is in jeopardy, and in that we can see that that's based on the extent to which the position is routine, is it skills-based, or is it a social position. So the more that it's routine and mundane, the more likely it's going to be easier for that job to be replaced. If it requires greater skills, then the less likely it is that it's going to be replaced. And so we can look at jobs and see, which ones are more vulnerable. So truck driving is going to be more vulnerable than, say, an educator. Now, if we want to look at companies, we can see that manufacturing is going to be affected, because with automation, you can produce goods more efficiently in a greater number of goods. This is going to affect things like, manufacturing, food service. You could have robots make burgers or whatever else, or just have computers where customers take orders. You don't need someone to take their order for them, or other kinds of accommodations that end up being most susceptible. Now, governments are also going to be affected. So developed economies are going to benefit greater than developing economies, because a developing economy is going to rely on labor to create a middle class. If they haven't yet established a middle class and you introduce automation, well, then this means a great number of people in that society are going to lack access to a middle class life. And this is going to increase, of course, economic inequality. Finally, if we want to look at consumers, automation will mean that there are lower costs to consumer goods, but it means there's going to be weakened community ties, right? Greater human alienation. That instead of interacting more with human beings, you're going to act more with robots, and we have to take into account what that is going to mean for the long term in society. Now, social contract theory is another way we can approach the issue of automation in business. So social contract theory asserts that rational individuals ought to give up some of their natural freedoms to the state in exchange for collective social benefits. That it is in the interest of one who has natural rights of, say, life, liberty, and property to give up some of your rights to liberty, for example, so you would have to submit to the laws passed by a government. But it's just rational to do so because the government is going to protect those rights. Who's going to come in and ensure someone, isn't going to steal your private property, or that there's going to be a punishment for doing so? It's going to be the government, right? Even though we don't directly consent to the authority of the government, we implicitly do so. Now, social individuals and entities that are formed, implied agreements, are driven by a hierarchy of norms. So we can look at businesses and we can look at to what extent are social entities like businesses kinds of implied agreements. To what extent do they form implied agreements? And what would that mean about their responsibilities to laborers, for example? So the authors say, in essence, laborers provide companies with labor with the expectation that companies will provide a living wage, a healthy and fair work environment, and adequate training while considering their employees' general well-being, right? This is the trade-off, that a worker, in a sense, consents to certain expectations, to certain norms. On the basis of that, it's going to pay off for them in the end. Well, if automation is going to take away their jobs and it's going to threaten all those payoffs, then it seems like, in some way the workers might be cheated with automation according to social contract theory. So what do both of these theories say businesses ought, what kind of approach they ought to take towards automation? Well, firstly, they need to acknowledge the transition. They need to invest in the workforce, to train employees such that if automation is going to make a certain kind of industry irrelevant for humans to work in, then the business has some kind of responsibility to set up the employees to be able to transition into another kind of career. So you need to retrain then those displaced workers. Now, another aspect actually is more on what government has to do. There's going to have to be some kind of wealth redistribution, maybe universal basic income or other kinds of things that can help offset maybe job loss or income loss due to automation. That there's going to need to be policies that reduce social injustice. Now, the onus is on governments, but this still is going to have an impact on business, which is why businesses might want to try to influence government to pass certain reforms like this, because automation is coming, right? And it's better that we're prepared than not prepared. This means businesses ought to embrace regulation and oversight instead of being opposed to it. That it is through regulation and oversight that stakeholders can best be accounted for, and that we can ensure businesses act ethically and incorporate into their decisions to implement automation, while taking into account, of course, the needs of their stakeholders, which they have a moral responsibility to do. Finally, there's going to have to be a way in which businesses can influence workers to create sources of meaning outside work. That if automation is inevitable, this means people are going to have to be less tied to finding meaning in the job they have, and see their time outside work as more of developing who they want to be and who they can be, and the potentials that they might encompass in terms of their own kind of self-realization, right? And so businesses have some kind of ethical obligation to facilitate that if they're going to potentially jeopardize the benefits that workers receive, because again, workers are part of the core stakeholders of a business.